It's Saturday afternoon here in the Revo Art Lab, and for some reason or another, I got thinking about lines, shapes, and forms. And this will probably be one of my more theoretical videos. I'm not someone who's just dispensing automatic formulas. Anybody who's been following me for a little bit or watches some of my videos, they're going to see that, like some other people who are teaching cartooning and art, I'm in the camp. There's different camps. I'm in the camp where I want to train your thinking, my thinking, and think about thinking. And that may sound very esoteric to some people. There may be even people who say, don't bore me with that, bro. Just show me how to draw a head. Just give me the thing, show it to me. Give me a formula that I can copy. That's everything that I'm against. I think that you should be an individual. You should evolve your own style. But that will come naturally out of understanding the deeper basics. And that means you have to kind of go upstream into thinking about the theory behind art. There's a time later, as I've said in other videos, where you cast that aside and you just draw and you create. But the structure of habit and thinking that you have in your mind, that you may or may not even be aware of as an artist, a cartoonist, that structure is going to dictate the final results. Now, what I see happening is that for a lot of people, particularly younger people now, they are very line-based in their approach to art and cartooning. That's kind of natural because lines are the end result of what you draw. You know, I was working on goofing around drawing heads, which I may do another video of profiles. But, you know, you're going to end up with the lines. But that's really only part of the process. I mean, it's natural to think in lines because as you draw cartoon lines, it's a language of lines. That's the thing that shows up in the final result. It's what you see in other people's work. And you can easily start there and try and copy from that surface of lines. And that's okay. I mean, if you do it consciously as an exercise to copy someone else's work in the lines and the designs, maybe even trace it to study it, that's great. I mean, you can learn a lot doing that. But the thing is that if you only do that and you only think and draw in terms of lines, you may be missing other aspects of design and art that may help you in your, what we may somewhat pretentiously call your art journey, or what I like to call the journey up Art Mountain. And you see the gods of art up at the top. You want to be like that, and you want to climb the slopes. You discover it's not that easy. So why am I talking about lines, shapes, and forms on a Saturday afternoon? Well, as I said, lines are the first thing you start, then shapes and forms. So let's go into a very simple discussion of that. I mean, this may seem too simple to some people, but I don't think so. My plea would be go a little bit backwards into things that you may think are too basic, that you already have under your belt, re-examine them, and then you can go forward and broaden out more. So a line, what's a line? It's open-ended, but if it starts turning around back on itself, you get a shape. You may get an almost closed shape. It's still a line, right? But it's looking like a shape, or whatever it might be. And you get all kinds of different ones. You get all kinds of different lines, zigzag, you know, sinuous. I don't have to go through them all, but they're all open-ended. You join them together, you start getting different shapes. This is an angled shape, you know, oval, circular, what have you. I'm going to need more of my ancient stack of Hilroy 3-lined paper here. Let's just save my chart for a little bit. So yeah, you've got your lines. You start turning around, you get into shapes, whatever it might be. Joins in on itself and makes an enclosed shape. Then we have this thing called forms. Okay, so these are three-dimensional forms in real life here. I've shown them on my other videos. My little skull. Of Got Mozart over here. Good old Mozart. There he is. His music is still resounding through the ages. That's a three-dimensional form. Now, I'm here drawing with the language of cartooning on a flat piece of paper. So I can't put a form on this paper. But what we're talking about with all of this is that if you're doing representational three-dimensional art, realistic so-called art, whether it's slightly cartoonier or whether it's more so-called realistic and rendered, you're trying to imply depth, and that's realistic space with real forms staged in space. And that's what you're trying to imply on the two-dimensional surface with lines and shapes. But here I'm going to say that there's an arrangement of forms you can get into, the classic one being sort of a cubic shape, set of shapes. Now what is that? If you explode that like an exploded view, you've got a diamond of some kind. You've got the side ones. So you've still got lines enclosing each shape, and then you've got three separate shapes to make the illusion of a three-dimensional form, which is in this case a cubic form, a very simple form. So why am I getting into all this again? I feel I need to kind of always reiterate, why does this matter? It's because I'm saying that if you only think in terms of lines as you create your compositions and drawings and cartoons, whatever it might be, whether it's something cartoony and fun or it's your demon god with horny horn fangs and teeth and everything, or whether it's whatever you like, your science fiction dream, your superhero muscle guy, you're going to be dealing with lines and shapes. But what is advisable, which you can see that all the older people did, is they learned to think in forms. I'm going to write that down here. Think in forms. That means that in your head, you can visualize different forms of all kinds, and you can turn them the way a 3D program would. And you can, here's Java Bali woman. I don't know where the heck I got this. She's a nudist of some kind. But, you know, you can visualize whatever you're designing in your mind and see it from different angles, right? If you're drawing ahead, you have this, maybe a simplified version of this, like they say in the Andrew Loomis books, but you have a simplified version of this in your head. And I can guarantee you, any accomplished, cartoonist that you revere as a god, whatever, the big art heroes, to some extent or another, they've done this study, and that's what they've internalized. They may or may not talk about it. They may or may not do art videos. They may or may not demonstrate it, and it might not be apparent when you see them draw that they have this knowledge base in their head. But I can guarantee you that they have studied this. They may not have formalized it, but I'm trying to do that for you because these videos I'm making are intended for anybody who's trying to put the pieces together and kind of assemble this kind of thinking. So what you need to do first to get that kind of thinking is you need to clearly distinguish for yourself the distinction between lines, shapes, and forms. They're not the same thing. And often you can interchange them, like you can mix up what a shape is versus a form. And, get that kind of all muddled up. But it's very important that you remember the distinction and you use them, because really if you learn to compose in forms in your mind, that ends up giving you the shapes, and then from that you get the lines. So you go in the reverse order here. You go from forms to shapes to lines. If you only start in terms of assemblages of lines, you can get into real trouble. At least that's the way I look at it. If you're doing a very flat kind of thing where you're not worried about three-dimensional space, implying that what I call the depth illusion. If you're doing a very flat decorative style of cartooning, left to right, in animation like the Hanna-Barbera things, it was very what's called left to right, or in decorative art like murals, as I said in my other video, Chinese murals where there's no real depth perspective and convergence implied. It's just all flat staged shapes of different sizes, and there's a minor implication sometimes of depth by making things slightly bigger or smaller, but it's a very flat thing. That's different. So what I'm going at here is if you're going for three-dimensional drawing. So, okay, so I think we're trying to distinguish between lines, shapes, when a line closes in on itself, and forms. And then, of course, different forms will have different assemblages of shapes. So, you know, if you've got something very planar, but this is going off in perspective, you know, you've got this one shape here, you've got a shape there, another one there. And I'm drawing on purpose. I'm doing simpler forms at first, which I'll get into in a second, the distinction between planar, simpler forms and organic shapes. Organic would being more rounded and there's no distinct edges. But of course, these are easier to draw because on something like a cube, or like here's my David Winter cottage, it's made out of these distinct forms so that when you have a sharp edge, it's both a planar edge of the, like there's one plane here meeting another plane there, and there's a sharp ridge. So that gives you a line to draw, and that makes it easier to understand. And it makes it easier to draw because you're just basically tracing the edges of, like if I'm drawing this cottage here, I'm just looking at it and going, okay, there's this, there's the chimney. I'm just roughly doing it, you know, with my chunky marker to keep things simple. I've got this little sub part here, what do you call it, the dormer, and it's intersecting. It would have this kind of thing. It's coming down a little bit. It's actually a little tricky to draw, but you see where I'm going with that, is that there are sharp edges to these things, and it makes it easier to draw. Now what happens is if you get into a more organic form, that's more rounded, like this is, here we'll go into something semi-organic, like it's got we're introducing a curve, like say imagine a curved piece of paper, and then you've got like curved forms here. This side plane would be flat, but these are curved, right? Let's do some more. Hopefully people will stick with me with this, and that this may seem overly simple because, you know, you want to always run and draw like something fancy, robots blowing up or space dinosaurs shooting laser beams at, you know, Rocket Raccoon or something. But the more you understand about basic forms, shapes and lines, and you have control over that, so you're doing it intentionally, the control starts in your mind. Then you can draw your space dinosaur shooting laser beams successfully, and you can make choices from there. Now again, a lot of people do a shortcut these days. They'll get a 3D model either from somewhere, a 3D asset, the 3D asset verse, or they will make a 3D model, which can be okay. I'm not like a fanaticist person saying you can't do any of this or that. I don't really care. I'm just saying that sometimes people do take shortcuts. They'll make a 3D model of something, turn it on their 3D program, and then just start tracing that. And you can do that. Nobody's stopping you. But if you don't understand this whole thing about the language of lines, shapes, and forms, and the 2D and 3D illusions and how to use all these things, there's a lot to be said about it. I mean, it would take many videos, which I intend on doing as many as I can think of, to explain this. But it takes a lot of words and time to explain. But once you kind of understand that language, then you can use the other tools, whether it's Photoshop layers, whether it's 3D programs, whatever it is. You can do it from a base of knowledge and understanding what effect your different choices will make. Like what's a better compositional choice? What's a better depth choice? I'm losing my cap here. So going back to organic forms. Okay, the heck with the cap. It's going to fall off again. Organic forms. So this would be like slightly more organic form, if you want to call it that. We're introducing curved, you know, say like you took a piece of paper here and you're just, and let's draw it transparently. You're thinking of it this way, right? And then let's say you introduce more curvature. So you make it like this. And this could be straight, or it could itself be pinched in. The point is that you're always thinking like this, as if there are contour lines drawn on it. You're thinking about it as a solid form, whatever it might be. I showed in other videos that I kept these, I don't know if you call them, they're not lasts, because those I think are forms that they use to make shoes. But these came from shoes I bought. They're in the shoe box, you know, like in the store. And they were keeping the display shoes plumpers. And I thought they were good to keep because look at these cool three-dimensional forms, right? And it's really something good like this to, as I said, it's an intermediate step between a fully organic form where everything's rounded and there's no distinct edges or planes meeting planes, and something very rigid. Like if you have a cube, it's very rigid. This is semi, and it's a bit of a complex discussion, but like say on this shape you have it curving in one plane. Here I tried to introduce to have it curving in two planes, or the reverse, like when you have something like spherical, they're curving in the other aspect. Now, actually, this sphere is something very interesting to get into because the sphere is the only thing that has, I mean, I've drawn lines on it, but if you think of trying to draw in cartooning a pure sphere, that's not a great circle, but it's good enough. It's got no interior shapes or lines. It's got one line. It's got one, the line is the shape, because unlike, let's say, the cube or any cubic form you could do, like this is a more complex one, you know, say like this. These are flat planes. I'm implying here, you know, like that, right? They're all flat. But this has got distinct shapes and lines and edges meeting edge, but a sphere doesn't have that, and its silhouette never changes because it's perfect. It's like no matter what angle you look at it from, it doesn't change. So in that sense, it's kind of boring, you know? And then you get into something like a head. You've got some planes and different things to understand, and it's definitely got a three-dimensional form, but it doesn't have that many distinct, like this is a skull, so it's got some distinct edges that are fairly sharp, and the sharper the edges, the more you have a line, right? But then you have areas like here that if you draw this in sheer cartoon form, and it's three-quarter view like this, where do you put a line? Do you put a line to define that plane? And that's the choice you get as a cartoonist, is like, where do I put lines? Where do I not put lines? Famously, when people draw things like noses, you know, they'll sometimes outline everything too much. And I don't know how to do it because I'm trying to not do that. But people will put very kind of complicated things too many places, and it's sort of like overkill. All right, I'm kind of circling around this discussion here, so let's circle back. What was I going to talk about? I was going to talk about this and then go on to my chart, except I'm not showing this clearly. So again, to recap, with fixed planar forms with flat planes, cubic, geometric type things, you have a simpler situation. It's probably good to start by learning these in your head because they give you the lines. But let's say you melted this slowly and it's kind of getting blobbier. It's like an ice cube that's slowly melting and it's starting to wobble. Well, you see how it's softening, the silhouette's softening here at the corners, right? And then you have a problem of, like, you still want to keep defining the cubic form, but do you make sharp edges here? That might be too much. So as a cartoonist, you might kind of do this to sort of define those planar edges like here, but you're leaving little breaks and you're leaving it softer, like say it's melting or whatever. Then you get into, say it melts even more, it's some kind of putty or whatever. Well, now you have something there, but you've lost, like, how, if you want it to look softer and more rounded, like it's melted, you've got a progression here. See, it's gotten more melted as we've gone down. How do you define that? You might have to think of lighting, like say lighting coming from one side. And depending on what marks you make, it's going to define what form it is. But here I'm just trying to suggest that, you know, anything you put, like you could use this same outline. Let's do that. Let's do that as an exercise. You see, you can think of these exercises for yourself. Let's move it up. I'm going to trace the same exact outline that I did before a couple of times. Okay, so it's the same outline, but depending on what lines you put, you can imply completely different forms. So say that versus, let me think of something different. Say I go like this and make it more like some kind of organic shell. Right? Now the outline is the same, but you're implying different forms here. Whoops, I've gone out of my frame. Sorry, that's modern problems. What I'm trying to show is, get my trusty chunky barrel, is, and you might do this with shading. Let's go back to doing it with this. Let's put some Mobius type, overly simple, but Mobius type lighting. Maybe you might imagine a light source from up here. And then the light's going to go like that. I'm always keeping in mind, light from up here. This is getting into a bit of rendering talk. Don't kill the highlight. Don't put too much where the highlight area would be. It's a rule I've been realizing recently. Don't kill that highlight. Let's do this here. I'm purposely doing this very chunky, very simple. I'm trying to show how you're thinking of form. I'm thinking of this in my mind as a three-dimensional piece of putty in front of me, right? Now it's still just lines and shapes and marks on paper. It's not like this in real life, it's an actual form. But all we have on paper was a two-dimensional language. So, that's kind of where I'm going with that. Like you can see that the outline is the same, but I've implied different volumes and solids, and you can go on endlessly. You know, I could have carved this out like the way this is. Let's try that. Let's do one more. Let's zoom out a bit. I need a studio photographer person to film these for me and tell me when I'm out of frame. But anyway, say we took it like this, you know, and we made a line here, kind of like this one, but even much more so. And we're carving, I'm imagining that I'm carving out so, and then here, that's softening the edge. See how if I put some hatching there versus like, say this one, it's sharp. If I soften it, it rounds the form a bit because you're rounding towards the light. And then I'm fading it out a bit here to make it look like the way, see this looks that it's fading out. So anyway, the whole plea of this is to think in terms of forms, because if you're thinking always of the forms, then the second thing you get to is the shapes. You're going to get different shapes from different angles, like say this one. If I'm looking at it straight on like that, I got this. I'm trying to do it from the way the camera sees it. Kind of roughly like that, right? So it's a basic model I made of a rib cage, a human rib cage. But if it goes like this, we've got different shapes in a kind of an upshot, like a low angle. And if I was to visualize the center lines, which is always a good thing to do, I haven't drawn them on this model, but you're always thinking of center lines, like again, like I have on this, center lines and side lines. Yeah, so three-dimensional thinking leads to shapes, leads to lines. I guess the last thing I'll show for this probably gotten my point across, is I have this really chart I love, which I showed in some of my earlier videos. Zoom back. It's too big to show the whole thing, but it's a shape that I got from an engineering book. Shape. It's a chart I got of forms. from an engineering book, and it's a very handy chart showing, which I printed a smaller version out here, of all the three-dimensional forms I'm pretty sure that exist, ranging from basic ones like sphere. You squash a sphere down and you get an oblate spheroid. Prolate, I guess, is vertically stretched. Torus or toroid, right? Then you have conic shapes. They haven't actually, I guess they could have organized this in different ways, but they've got a cone up here, so it's a right angle cone. Down here, when you get conic effects, and then these are involving, I don't pretend to have a completely fast way to describe all this, but it's really, really interesting. Pyramid type things, which is here, it's called a tetrahedron. And I think it's got a base, which is a triangle, a three-sided triangle, not it, which is triangle. Here's a right pyramid, which is four-sided base. And oblique, it's stretched over. Right prism, oblique prism. And you can go through it. See, again, someone might be thinking, okay, that's a little dry, it's a little engineering, a little technical. Why do I need to bother with all that? The thing is that, again, if you want to draw three-dimensionally from your head, unaided, which is what I would suggest, that you really need that tool if you want a full grasp on what you're doing, or as full a grasp as you're able to get, because none of us know what limit we're going to reach. But if you want to keep progressing, things like this are very useful, because what tends to happen is if you start, this is me going back to the beginning of this video, if you start from the surface of cool art that you see people you like, and you look at their lines and shapes of the way they draw, figures or backgrounds, and you start absorbing their mannerisms, you get usually a small corral of stuff that you can do. It's like a habit forming thing. And particularly if you put that on social media in the modern times, and you get success, everyone goes like. Oh, that's really cool. What can happen, I think you could argue, is that you tend to sort of go with that and just keep going, and you don't retreat and get a wider vocabulary in your head, in your mind, being able to visualize far more stuff. The utility of looking at something like this is it reminds us of all kinds of different other forms, shapes, like I said, lines, shapes, and forms that are out there in nature. This is a charted way of like diagramming a whole bunch of basic ones. And of course, in nature, you're not usually going to see things as distinctly, although in some cases you might, like with things like crystals. But in either human-made objects or in natural organic forms like plants and trees and so on, you may get variations of these that aren't as clearly distinct. Like in this chart, how many things do we have? We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. 27, for whatever reason, 27 basic distinctions of these things. And I think that that's really, really good to do, to start looking for these things, learning how to draw them from different angles. There's a whole thing I need to do some videos on called intersections, where two things run into each other and what happens then. And you have some of that shown here, like in a way this helical convolute is showing the intersection between this a moving circular, it's like a cylinder here at the center, and I guess it's a rotating plane that's spiraling upwards around it, which is kind of cool. And yeah, this one, convolute. See, I got to learn about all these things. Oops, zoom back, Paul. Convolute. It looks like there's an oval at one end that's rotated by the other end to the other vertical plane. Over here at this end, it's sideways, and it's like twisting. So you get a very interesting, fascinating shape there, like almost like you might get, for example, in a tree trunk twisting as it grows. But anyway, this whole video is really about understanding the distinction between forms, shapes, and lines. It's understanding that as a cartoonist, you may be dealing at the end result with, like in your actual drawing, if you're doing a line medium, whether it's brush lines or, thinner pen lines, you're dealing in lines, and they assemble shapes. And then if you're doing it well and trying to do three-dimensional art, you're using that to suggest form. But it really is worthwhile to break this down and think about this stuff and practice drawing pieces of this stuff, like practice drawing some of these forms. Get some forms of your own. I made this, like I said in my other video years ago. There's lots more I could do. I could take this and do grid lines on it. Say I had a bunch of these. I kind of like it the way it is, but you could put grid contour lines to practice drawing. I've got Batman here, which is good. He's much more complex, of course, in terms of forms, but he's useful. If I draw Batman, I look at this carefully. It's a bit exaggerated in terms of the proportions, like Batman's head here is really small compared to his body. They're doing that superhero thing. So you can adjust all those things, but where this is very useful is just in visualizing the three-dimensional forms of a hero or of the way his belt goes around. This is one version of Batman. The purists of Batman, the fans would know exactly which one. Is this the Dark Knight Batman? I don't know, but I guess so. He's got the boots, the Frank Miller boots, is it? I'm sure the comments will tell me. But it's good for studying forms and angles and stuff. So I'm going to end it there. I hope that was useful. Think about basic forms. Think about exploded views of things. Think of your drawing as all components of flat shapes. And then really when you break it further down, you've got each shape being bounded by lines. And I'm going to do more on this, but thanks for watching. Please comment, like, share, subscribe, describe, anything else. Follow. Following is subscribing. I don't know. They're all different on different things, aren't they? Subscribe on YouTube. Follow me on X. And I'll see you later. Thank you.